I'm Margaret Frondorf. I'm the Director of SAIS Alumni Relations, and I am here with Herschelle Sullivan Challenor, class of 1963. It's April 11th, 2013, and we're absolutely so pleased to have you here. In fact, you're celebrating the 50th year since you graduated from SAIS in 1963. That's the occasion of your visit here to SAIS.
Yes.
So I want to ask you a couple of questions and go from there. And I think my first question is what brought you to SAIS?
You want the short answer or the long answer?
I want any answer that you want to tell me.
Fine. When my sister and I were growing up, my mother's sister, our aunt, came to live with us after she was with the Red Cross during World War II. And she came and she lived with us until I went off to undergraduate school. And she had been in the Asian theater. And I was always fascinated by her life overseas and her travel and the stories she had. So I was thinking then already, as a junior high school student, well, even elementary school, I guess, about international affairs. When I went to Spelman, Charles E. Merrill gave a grant to allow students to spend a year of study abroad. And I decided I wanted one of those grants. And I did get it, but only in my senior year. And so I was studying in Paris for the academic year 59-60. But even before I left, Spelman College is in Atlanta. And before I left, the beginnings of the civil rights activity started. I remember we went to one of the public libraries where African Americans were not allowed, and we were asked to leave. While I was overseas, my classmates, who were still there, they were in their senior year then, elected me in absentia president of the student body. So when I came back to Spelman in 60-61, the civil rights movement was in full swing, and I became the co-chair of the Atlanta sit-in movement. And some of the students who had been involved in the civil rights movement went on to become lawyers. Marion Wright Edelman, for example. Marion and I were classmates at Spelman, but she went to Europe the year before I did. So she came back and went to law school. Two of the people who were in the same year and were graduated the year I did, the chair, Lonnie King, went to law school. A man who was on the executive board, Ben Brown, is now deceased, went to law school. I didn't want to go to law school, but I felt guilty. I remember when I was up here at SAIS, my first year, you know, because I'd been to jail twice and spent most of that last semester on the picket line. I was getting so depressed and feeling so badly because things were still going on, and I had wished that I was still there and feeling guilty being here at SAIS. And E. Franklin Frazier, who was at Howard University then, taught a course. He was allowed to teach one course at SAIS. And I never took his course, but I was feeling so depressed that I called him and said, "May I come speak to you because I'm really having a problem?" And I did go up to Howard to see him, and I told him, I said, "Here I am in this all-white institution, and my people are suffering, you know, in Atlanta." And he said, "Look, you'll be of greater assistance to your people when you have your degree. So you just stay in school, young lady," which was excellent advice. But because of the civil rights movement, I chose Africa as an area of concentration. So that's the long answer. Oh, I had heard about SAIS, and I'm trying to wonder who had mentioned it to me. I became very close to Willard Johnson, who was one of the previous graduates. And of course, I met the subsequent graduate, who was head of the City University, what is it, the fund?
Not sure.
Anyway, within the past 10 years, he had an appointment at the State Department. It didn't last very long. I'm sure he found it too bureaucratic for him. Excuse me. So I had heard about SAIS. I guess from maybe a faculty member had mentioned it to me. And so that's why I came. And I had examined the several schools of international affairs and decided I wanted this one.
So in thinking about your 2 years here, and boy was it an interesting time to be in Washington, talk about, I don't know, tell me about something that stands out for you, a vivid memory. It could be, I don't know, it could be academics, it could be politics, whatever. What's something that stands out?
Well,
the early 60s.
Because I think you young people have a greater appreciation of how students reacted to our surroundings. My parents drove me up here. We were living in Pittsburgh then, and I couldn't find a place to stay. Finally, I was able to get a room with an African-American woman who lived not too far from Howard University. Well, that was too far. And I'm not sure how it happened, but I guess I heard from one of the classmates, from Shayla Buckley, that there was this apartment building, and I guess she was looking for a roommate. And so I came down to see the landlady to see if I could be one of her boarders. And she said, absolutely not. Well, I don't think she said that to my face. But she said no. She said something. And I found out from Ronnie, I guess. She told Isabel Gruen, who was a graduate of the class of, what would that be, 1964? Two. Isabel Gruen, who's now at, retired, but still teaches at Santa Clara, is it, California? She said her ancestors had slaves, and she certainly would not allow any African American. Well, we were black then. Was it 65 yet? No, we were still colored. Okay. No colored people to live in her building. And Ronnie talked her into it. So,
Ronnie did tell me that story, I have to tell you.
Yes, and so that's a vivid memory for me, because that was...
How did that make you feel?
Badly, of course.
Were you angry?
Of course I was angry.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
And then I just felt sorry for her.
Ah.
That she'd been carrying this burden all of her life. And hopefully, before she died, she got over it. But anyway, so that was a vivid impression. At one second year, Shayla lived with someone else, and I was again looking. And I went to an apartment complex and tried to get in there, and because they had advertised. And I walked in, got in the elevator, and the owner said, "What are you doing here? What are you doing here? Get out! Get out!" It was the year that Washington, D.C., it must have been 62, was supposed to desegregate, I guess, public accommodations or whatever it was that was still officially segregated. Oh, this woman was hysterical. So, I walked out and I said, okay, but I'll be back. And I've gone back to visit a friend who finally owned one of the apartments in that building. So, the racial dimension of Washington was vivid for me. In terms of SAIS itself, I thoroughly enjoyed it. As Shayla Buckley must have told you, we lived in essentially a townhouse across the street from Johns Hopkins, from SAIS. And so we were all pretty good friends. Peter Bertacci, Sam
Ray.
Sam Ray, that's right. Sam was also from Pittsburgh. I was raised in Pittsburgh, but born in Atlanta. And there was somebody else. Was it Steve Lesser who was their third roommate? I'm not sure. There were three of the guys, and then Shayla and myself. And so it was a wonderful time in terms of having those other classmates around, because they were just extraordinary people. I just want to say one other thing. The other thing I remember is you still have those exams, your language exams. And I don't know what happened. I guess I thought it was another day. But the day of my exams in French, I had slept in, and I wonder if she's still here. The lady who taught who did the French. Her husband worked with the State Department as a language escort.
I hear she's in France.
Oh, it's wonderful. The couple was wonderful. Anyway, she called me and she said, Madame Sullivan, Mademoiselle Sullivan, and on about, your exam is supposed to be right now. Where are you? So I rushed over, and apparently I was the only student that passed the French language exam that year.
That's awesome. So, a good segue. Talk a little bit about your career and your accomplishments.
Well, this is a bit of SAIS too. That summer of my first year, I went on Operation Crossroads Africa. And I just found out that Sam and Betsy both went on Crossroads Africa. And I was in, it was then Upper Volta. It's now Burkina Faso. And that had a profound impact on me. And so in terms of my career focus, I've stayed in international relations and African studies, mainly Francophone Africa. But the man who was our group leader then was Dr. Elliot Skinner, who was professor of anthropology at Columbia University. Excuse me, and he was from the Caribbean. Trinidad, I believe, and very aggressive. You must get a doctorate, you must. I said, okay, okay. So he talked me in, because I had, by the way, I had applied to Columbia when I applied to Johns Hopkins, and they turned me down. But I guess because I had been able to survive Hopkins, the second time I applied for my doctorate, I was admitted. All right, so I did go straight after SAIS to Columbia to complete a doctorate degree in political science with specialization in international affairs and African studies. Right. I did field research in, it was then Dahomey, Benin, in Francophone West Africa. And it's where I met my husband and got married. He had been, well, he was a physician specializing in epidemiology and public health. Got his MPH from Harvard. And Bernie had been a Peace Corps physician in Malawi and the then Bangladesh. And because when I was young, I said I never wanted to marry a doctor. They were always so stuffy, and at least in the African American community, very uppity up, you know. But he wasn't that way at all. He's out of New York. His parents are from Barbados, and he very, very focused on international affairs. Another Atlanta story, but related to my then husband. When he went down to CDC to start working for this program, he was the first African American. And a book has now been written about the EPI program. It's an epidemiological program where they send people out like SWAT teams to work for diseases that you want me to hurry up. All right. From when I completed my doctorate, Bernie and I went to Boston. He worked for Model Cities in Boston after I finished my field research. And then my first job was teaching at Brooklyn College, Political Science Department, which was great. I had never eaten bagels before, even though I'd been to Columbia. And so it was a different experience. Did I say Boston College? Brooklyn College. Heavily Jewish. And I guess it was the first time I had knowingly been around so many Jewish Americans. And they're very assertive, which is a nice trait. And in fact, people in Atlanta say, Herschelle, you're just so outspoken. I said, I learned that from my Jewish American colleagues. I was shocked by it when I first met it. So, Brooklyn College, I'd never wanted to be a professor, so I got bored with that. And I took, I guess, a leave of absence to take an American Political Science Association Congressional Fellowship. And I chose to work with Congressman Charles C. Diggs, Democrat out of Michigan, who also happened to be the chairman of the Subcommittee on Africa. So that's why I wanted to work with him. So I spent 2 years working in his office, but often doing things related to Africa, mainly doing constituency mail, quite frankly. Then I had an offer to work at the Ford Foundation. Rockefeller had given $100 million to the Ford Foundation to strengthen we were black then, higher education. And the man who was running the program invited me to come up for an interview and offered me a job. So I took that. And then when I was there after 2 years, it was an initial contract of 2 years, Congressman Diggs called me and asked me to come down and be the staff director of the Subcommittee on Africa. So then I came back to Washington to work on the Hill, and that was my dream job. I loved it. I absolutely adored it. But unfortunately, he was indicted for using some of his congressional funds for personal purposes. He was on his third marriage then, and so he had all of these children and wives to take care of. So he was skimming off, apparently, regrettably, those funds in order to pay his alimony and for the children. To his credit, Congressman Diggs always loved the children from all of his wives. Well, there weren't that many, just 2 before Janet. He married, I guess when I was there, working with him then, a State Department Foreign Service officer, his last one. But the previous one was a lawyer, one was a physician. He always married intelligent women, and he paid his alimony, and he supported his children.
And what were some of the issues on the Hill that were most memorable for you?
Desegregation. Decolonization of sub-Saharan Africa. We were there during the high point of that issue. And he loved traveling abroad. So he was always arranging a CODEL, a congressional delegation. So, in part because of him, but because of my continuing interest in Africa, I've been to 47 of the 53 countries on the African continent. Another thing that I did there that was absolutely memorable, we were in Israel when Sadat made his visit to Israel, and we were staying in the King David Hotel. He left. He said, "Herschelle, I don't think I want to be here when Sadat comes." He said, I'm going to our next trip, which was, I guess, our next place, I guess, was Paris. I'm not sure. Yes, we were to pick up a flight. Oh, that was a subsequent trip. No, it was that flight. We were to pick up a Russian flight there to go to Cuba. And I said, well, I'd really like to stay, and this is historic. And he said, well, that's all right, you stay, and then you come to Paris when it's over. And that was the most memorable experience that I've ever had. We had met Sadat by then. He had come to speak on the Hill before then, and it was very interesting. Sadat would always say, he'd get a group of staff aides together, but he would always turn to those of us who were African American. He said, my mother was from Nubia, and I have he didn't say real African blood, but that was the point he was trying to make, I'm part black too. But he was such a warm, gregarious person, really, in terms of his personality, just a lovely human being. So, Diggs left, and it was interesting. Some of the other members of Congress were still there, because we met with the Prime Minister the day before, and he told us that Sadat was coming, because it hadn't been made public then. So some of the other congressmen stayed. But when Sadat was to enter the hotel, all of the people of European descent went to the second floor. I guess they were afraid something was going to happen, something dangerous was going to happen. And so I said, well, I'm sorry, I'm staying downstairs with the Palestinian servants. So I can be there on the main floor when he opens that door. And I can't tell you, when he opened that door, a lot of the Palestinians just cried. It was so important to them. And it was a remarkable experience for me too. You know, the other members of Congress are watching television upstairs and the other aides. But it was moving. And to think that nothing else has occurred to improve their status since then is unfortunate, to say the least. But that was important, and you know, all of these incidents kind of informed what I ended up doing. While I was working with the Diggs, UNESCO had, what happened? There had been a vote in UNESCO, I guess in you're looking at your clock, at around I think 64, about a year before I left the Hill. So we've been maybe in the maybe it was 74. Because of Israel, the UNESCO is structured like the UN is too, in terms of its member states in regional groupings, 5. And the European grouping, where UNESCO, Israel is aspired to be a member, because it's geographically in that region, in part, denied it admission into the European group. And of course the United States was appalled and decided to withdraw withdraw its funds from UNESCO. It stopped funding UNESCO for a while. And I was deeply concerned because the man who was then the Director General of UNESCO, Amadou Mataimbo, was a Senegalese, whom I had met while I was doing my field research. I'd gone up to Paris to interview him. If you have time for this, you say you have time. I wanted to speak with him because I did research on a dispute between the Beninese and the host countries in which they work. Senegal was one of them, Côte d'Ivoire, and then Niger. They were kicked, well, the Beninese got to be in this position as intermediaries, if you will. They worked for the French Foreign Service, but always only in Africa. So they became intermediaries between the French and the host country nationals in those countries where they were assigned to work. I guess they worked mainly as interpreters because they were resented. And so that was the topic of my dissertation. Dahomeyans are strangers.
Yeah. Let me just move to, I know you met a couple students downstairs, and I'm sure they asked your advice. And if you could offer advice to a SAIS student today in terms of kind of your vision coming in to SAIS, and you are the first African-American female to graduate from this institution in 1963. I guess what advice would you have for female graduates?
Would be the same I have for male graduates. First of all, decide what you want to do, what your career goal is, not just to work in international affairs, but where in international affairs.